The rope bit into Jeremiah Cooper's wrists as he knelt in the dust of Prescott's Main Street, and the crowd that had gathered to watch a hanging pressed closer with every passing second. "You have the wrong man," he said again, his voice raw from shouting it for the better part of an hour. "I never robbed that stage. I was 30 miles east on the night you claim I did it." Sheriff Dale Hutchins spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt beside Jeremiah's boot. "That is what every guilty man says, Cooper. The description matches, the horse matches, the Colt Navy revolver in your saddlebag matches. Bounty hunters do not usually catch innocent men." Jeremiah's jaw tightened. He had spent 6 years hunting men who deserved hunting, and now the very system he had served was about to hang him for a crime committed by someone who merely resembled him. The irony was so bitter it nearly choked him. "There has to be someone," he said, scanning the crowd with desperate eyes. "Someone who saw me that night." That was when Louise Collins pushed through the wall of onlookers, her calico dress dusted with chalk from the schoolhouse, her dark hair pinned back but coming loose at the temples from her hurried walk across town. She was not supposed to be here. She had heard the commotion from her classroom window, had seen the children abandon their slates to run toward the noise, and something in her chest had told her this was not a spectacle to be missed, but an injustice to be stopped. "Sheriff Hutchins," she called out, her voice carrying with the same authority she used to quiet a room of unruly students. "I need to speak with you before you do something you cannot undo." Hutchins turned, irritation flickering across his weathered face. "Miss Collins, this is not schoolhouse business." "It is my business," she said, stepping closer, "because I know this man is innocent and I have proof." The crowd murmured. Jeremiah lifted his head, meeting her eyes for the first time. He had never seen this woman before in his life, and yet she stood there claiming to hold the key to his survival. Hope, dangerous and unfamiliar, flared in his chest. "Proof," Hutchins repeated skeptically. "What kind of proof does a schoolteacher have about a stagecoach robbery?" Louise reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small leather ledger, its pages worn soft at the corners. "I have been tutoring the Hendricks boy on Tuesday and Thursday evenings for the past 2 months. On the night of the robbery, I passed this man on the Prescott Road, riding east toward the Verde Valley. At nearly the same hour, the robbery is said to have occurred 30 miles west of here. I wrote it in my journal because I remember thinking it was unusual for a stranger to be riding alone so late, and because his horse had a distinctive white sock on its front left leg, which this man's horse does not have." She gestured toward the horse tied at the hitching post, its 4 legs uniformly brown. "That does not prove anything," Hutchins said, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "It proves a timeline," Louise said sharply. "A man cannot be in 2 places at once, Sheriff, and I am prepared to swear to this before any judge in the territory. I keep detailed records because it is my habit as a teacher to document the world around me. I did not simply see a man on a horse. I recorded the date, the hour by my father's pocket watch, the direction he traveled, and identifying details about the horse. If you hang this man and I am later proven right, the guilt of an innocent man's death rests on your head, not mine." The crowd had gone utterly silent. Jeremiah stared at her, this stranger who had appeared like some avenging angel of logic and record-keeping, unraveling the noose around his neck with nothing but a leather-bound journal and an iron will. Hutchins looked from Louise to Jeremiah and back again, clearly torn between the momentum of a hanging already set in motion, and the very real fear of hanging an innocent man on the word of a woman who was, by all accounts, known throughout Prescott for her honesty and her sharp mind. "This is not proof enough to release him outright," Hutchins finally said, "but it is enough for a delay. We will hold him for trial and you will testify before Judge Marsh." The rope loosened. Jeremiah felt the blood rush back into his hands as the deputy untied his wrists, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to breathe. His eyes found Louise Collins again, and something passed between them that neither could yet name, something that felt like the first crack of light through a door long sealed shut. 3 weeks earlier, Jeremiah Cooper had ridden into the Arizona Territory, following a trail that led him from Tucson northward, chasing a bounty of $400 on a man named Silas Reed, wanted for the robbery of the Butterfield stage line near Wickenburg. Reed was said to be tall, dark-haired, with a scar above his left eyebrow, riding a bay gelding with a white sock. Jeremiah had tracked such men for 6 years, ever since the war had left him with nothing but a strong back, a steady hand, and a hatred of chaos that made him good at restoring order, even if that order came at the end of a gun barrel. He had been raised on a small farm outside of Abilene, Kansas, the son of a preacher who died when Jeremiah was 14, leaving him to work the land alone with his mother, until she too passed from a fever 2 years later. He had drifted west after that, taking whatever work a strong young man could find, until the war came and swallowed 4 years of his life in blood and smoke. When it ended, he found he had no taste for farming anymore, no patience for the slow rhythms of planting and harvest. The bounty trail suited him. It gave him purpose, a code to live by even in a lawless land. He caught bad men and brought them to justice, and in doing so, he told himself he was making some small repair to a world that had broken him. But this time, the world had broken him instead. He had ridden into Prescott 2 days prior, following a tip that Silas Reed had been seen drinking at the Palace Saloon. Instead, Sheriff Hutchins and 2 deputies had ambushed him outside the livery stable, mistaking his similar height, his dark hair, and the general description circulating on the wanted poster for the man he himself was hunting. In the chaos of his arrest, no one had listened to his protests. No one had checked his identification papers, which he carried in a hidden pocket of his vest, until it was almost too late. By the time anyone thought to look, the town had already whipped itself into a frenzy over catching the notorious stage robber, and Hutchins, eager to prove his competence to the territorial marshal, had rushed toward a hanging rather than a proper investigation. It was, Jeremiah would later reflect, the single greatest injustice of his life, made all the more bitter by the fact that he had spent years enforcing the very system that nearly killed him without cause. Now, sitting in the small stone jail cell that smelled of mildew and old sweat, he turned over the memory of Louise Collins's face in his mind. She had not looked at him with pity, the way some women might look at a condemned man. She had looked at him with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone solving a puzzle, someone who trusted facts over fear, and there was something in that gaze that struck him harder than any blow he had taken in the war. The trial was set for 8 days later, giving the circuit judge time to arrive from Tucson. In those 8 days, Louise visited the jail 3 times, each time bringing her ledger and asking Jeremiah careful questions about his movements, cross-referencing his account against her own notes to build an airtight timeline. "You said you crossed the wash near Skull Valley around 9 in the evening," she said on her second visit, seated on a wooden stool the deputy had grudgingly allowed her, the ledger open on her knee. But the robbery occurred at approximately 8:45, according to the stage driver's statement. "That gap is too narrow for you to have committed the robbery and then traveled the distance to where I saw you. You sound like a lawyer," Jeremiah said, watching her through the iron bars with something between admiration and disbelief. "I sound like someone who values precision," Louise replied, not looking up from her writing. "My father was a surveyor before he passed. He taught me that details matter, that the world can be understood if you simply pay close enough attention to it." "Most people do not pay attention, Mr. Cooper. They see what they expect to see. And what did you expect to see that night on the road?" She paused then, pencil hovering over the page, and for the first time since he had met her, something like uncertainty crossed her face. "I did not expect anything. I simply saw a man on a horse, alone, riding with purpose. I remember thinking he looked burdened, as though he carried something heavier than saddlebags." Jeremiah studied her, this woman who saw so much and revealed so little of herself in return. "I was carrying the weight of 6 years hunting men for money," he admitted quietly. It gets heavy after a while, deciding whether justice and money are the same thing. Louise's pencil resumed its movement, but her eyes lifted briefly to meet his. "And have you decided?" "Not yet," he said. "Ask me again after the trial." On her third visit, 3 days before the trial, she came alone in the early evening, after the schoolhouse had emptied of children and the deputy had stepped out to eat his supper. The jailhouse was quiet except for the creak of the wooden building settling in the cooling desert air. "I want to understand something," Jeremiah said, leaning against the bars, close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes in the lamplight. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. You have no reason to risk your reputation in this town over a stranger who might, for all you know, be lying to you." Louise met his gaze steadily. "Because 6 years ago, I watched a man hang in Tucson for a crime he did not commit. I was 19, newly arrived from Ohio to take a teaching position, and I witnessed the trial. The evidence against him was circumstantial, built on assumption rather than fact, and no one questioned it because questioning it was inconvenient. I have never forgotten the sound of the crowd cheering as they raised him up. I swore then that if I ever again saw an injustice I had the power to prevent, I would not stay silent, no matter the cost to myself." Her voice had grown tight with old grief, and Jeremiah felt something shift inside his chest, some wall he had built during the war and reinforced through years of solitary bounty hunting beginning to crack. "That took courage," he said softly, "more courage than most people have." "It is not courage," Louise said, shaking her head. "It is simply refusing to look away. Anyone could do it if they chose to." "Not anyone would," Jeremiah countered. "Most people look away because it is easier. You did not." "That makes you different, Miss Collins." A faint blush colored her cheeks, quickly hidden as she busied herself closing her ledger. "We should focus on your trial, Mr. Cooper, not on flattering conversation." But as she left that evening, Jeremiah found himself watching the door long after it had closed behind her, replaying her words, her steady eyes, the quiet fire beneath her composed exterior. He had hunted men across 3 territories, had faced down outlaws with pistols drawn, had survived cannon fire and bayonet charges during the war, but nothing had unsettled him quite like the calm certainty of this schoolteacher who had decided, for reasons of her own dark past, that his life was worth saving. The morning of the trial arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn morning common to the Arizona high desert in October of 1878. Prescott's small courthouse, a simple adobe building with a shingled roof, filled quickly with townspeople eager to see how the matter would resolve. Judge Marsh, a stern man with silver mutton chops and a reputation for fairness that bounty hunters like Jeremiah had come to respect over the years, took his seat at the front of the room and called the proceedings to order. The prosecution, led by the territorial attorney sent from Tucson, presented the wanted poster, the physical description, and the testimony of the stage driver, who admitted under careful questioning that he had only glimpsed the robber briefly in poor evening light before being struck and losing consciousness. Then Louise Collins took the stand. She wore a simple gray dress with her hair pinned neatly beneath a small hat, and when she raised her hand to swear the oath, her voice did not waver. She presented her ledger to the judge, walking through her methodology with the precision of a woman who had spent years teaching children to think logically and record their observations honestly. She detailed the date, the hour verified by her father's pocket watch which she produced as evidence, the direction of travel, the distinctive white sock on the horse she had seen, and the absence of that same marking on Jeremiah's horse, which she noted had been examined by the local farrier at her request just that morning. "Miss Collins," the prosecutor said, attempting to discredit her, "is it not possible that in the darkness you simply misjudged the coloring of the horse's leg?" "It is not possible," Louise replied evenly, "because I carried a lantern that evening, having just come from tutoring a student whose family lives along that stretch of road. I saw the horse clearly for several seconds as the defendant passed me and offered a polite greeting, which I returned. "I do not make careless observations, sir. I have taught geometry and grammar to the children of this town for 4 years, and precision is the foundation of everything I teach them." A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. Several parents in attendance nodded, recognizing in her testimony the same rigorous character they had come to expect from their children's teacher. The prosecutor tried a different angle. And why should this court believe that a schoolteacher's memory of a passing rider, weeks after the fact, constitutes reliable evidence? Louise reached into her satchel and withdrew her ledger once more. "Because I did not rely on memory alone, sir. I recorded the encounter the very night it occurred, as is my habit with anything unusual I observe. This is not memory reconstructed after the fact to suit a convenient narrative. This is a contemporaneous record, written within an hour of the event, before I had any knowledge that Mr. Cooper would ever be accused of a crime. I would ask the court to consider which is more reliable, the fear-driven recollection of a stagecoach driver who was struck unconscious moments after glimpsing his attacker, or the careful, dated record of a witness with no stake in the outcome beyond a commitment to truth." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Marsh studied Louise for a long moment, then turned his attention to the ledger itself, examining the entry with its careful handwriting and precise notations. He compared the dates against the official report of the robbery, checked the timeline against the distance between the two locations, and nodded slowly. "This is compelling evidence," Judge Marsh said. "Combined with the discrepancy in the horse's markings, and the fact that no stolen property was found on the defendant despite a thorough search at the time of his arrest, I find the prosecution's case insufficient to sustain a conviction." He turned to Jeremiah, who sat at the defense table with his hands clenched together, hardly daring to hope. "Mr. Cooper, this court finds you not guilty of the charges brought against you. You are free to go, with the court's apologies for the ordeal you have endured." The gallery erupted into a mixture of murmurs and applause, and Jeremiah closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the noose that had nearly claimed him lift entirely from his shoulders. When he opened them again, he sought out Louise Collins across the crowded room and found her already watching him, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of her mouth. He crossed the room without thinking, ignoring the well-wishers and the curious onlookers, until he stood before her, close enough to see the exhaustion beneath her composed exterior, the toll that days of careful preparation and the pressure of testifying had taken on her. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "I do not know how to repay that." "You do not owe me anything, Mr. Cooper," Louise said. "I simply told the truth." "The truth would have meant nothing if you had not been brave enough to speak it," he replied. "Most people in this town were ready to watch me hang without a second thought. You were the only one who looked closer." Louise's cheeks colored again, that same faint blush he had noticed in the jailhouse, and she looked away toward the window, where the autumn sunlight streamed through in golden bars. "I could not simply stand by, Mr. Cooper. Not after what I witnessed in Tucson all those years ago. I made a promise to myself, and promises matter." "Jeremiah," he said suddenly, "please call me Jeremiah. After what you have done for me, Mr. Cooper feels far too formal." She glanced back at him, something warm flickering in her brown eyes. "Jeremiah, then, and you may call me Louise." Outside the courthouse, the town of Prescott continued its ordinary business, unaware or uncaring that a man's entire future had just been rewritten within those adobe walls. But for Jeremiah Cooper and Louise Collins, standing together in the aftermath of near tragedy, something new and fragile had begun to take root, something neither of them could yet name but both could feel pulling at them like a current beneath still water. In the days that followed his acquittal, Jeremiah found himself reluctant to leave Prescott, though every instinct honed over 6 years of bounty hunting told him to move on, to collect what remained of his gear from the sheriff's office and continue the pursuit of Silas Reed, the real robber whose crimes had nearly cost Jeremiah his life. But something held him in place, and he told himself it was simple gratitude, a need to properly thank the woman who had saved him, though he suspected even then that the truth ran deeper. He took a room at the small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, who fed her tenants a hearty breakfast of biscuits and salt pork each morning, and asked no questions about a man's past so long as his rent was paid on time. From his window, he could see the schoolhouse 2 streets over, a simple whitewashed building with a small bell tower, and each morning he found himself watching for a glimpse of Louise as she walked to begin her day's teaching, her dark hair catching the early light, her posture straight and purposeful despite the modest cut of her dresses. On the third morning, he finally worked up the nerve to intercept her path, falling into step beside her as she crossed the dusty street toward the schoolhouse. "Miss Collins," he said, tipping his hat despite their earlier agreement to use first names, some old habit of formality reasserting itself in the daylight after the intimacy of the jailhouse and courtroom. "I was hoping I might walk with you a moment." Louise glanced at him, a small smile touching her lips. "Jeremiah, I thought we had already settled on names." "Old habits," he said, returning her smile. "I wanted to ask if you might allow me to take you to supper sometime, as a proper thank you for what you did. Not the boarding house fare, but something better. There is a small restaurant near the Palace Saloon that serves a decent steak, from what I have heard." Louise's expression grew thoughtful, and Jeremiah felt a flicker of nervousness he had not experienced since his early days facing down armed outlaws. "That is generous of you, but I should warn you that accepting such an invitation from a man recently acquitted of robbery, however wrongly accused, might invite gossip in a town this size." "Are you afraid of gossip, Louise?" She laughed then, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even herself. "I have weathered worse than gossip, Mr. Cooper. I simply wanted you to understand what you were inviting upon yourself by associating with me. The town already whispers about a schoolteacher who speaks too boldly in courtrooms." "Then let them whisper," Jeremiah said. "I would be honored if you accepted." Louise studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes assessing him the same way they had assessed the evidence in his case, weighing and measuring, and finally she nodded. "Very well. Saturday evening, after my students have gone home for the week." The supper, when it came, revealed layers of Louise Collins that Jeremiah had not anticipated. She spoke with easy fluency about geography and history, about the mathematics she taught her older students, about her father's work surveying land across 3 states before a fall from a rock face had claimed his life 5 years prior. She spoke of her mother, still living in Ohio, who wrote letters every month begging her only daughter to return east and marry a respectable banker's son rather than teach children in a rough frontier town. "Why did you come west, then, if your mother wished otherwise?" Jeremiah asked, cutting into his steak. "Because I wanted to matter," Louise said simply. "In Ohio, I would have been another young woman waiting to be chosen by a suitable husband, my days filled with needlework and polite conversation. Out here I could teach. I could shape young minds, help children learn to read and write and reason for themselves. I could be useful in a way that felt like my own choice, not simply the role assigned to me by birth." Jeremiah found himself leaning forward, captivated by the fire in her voice. "That is not so different from why I took up bounty hunting, in a strange way. After the war, I could not go back to farming. I needed something that felt like it mattered, some way to impose order on a world that had shown me nothing but chaos." "And has it mattered?" Louise asked, echoing her own question from the jailhouse. "Has bounty hunting given you the meaning you sought?" Jeremiah considered this carefully, aware that his answer mattered more to him than it should for a man who had known this woman scarcely 2 weeks. "I thought it had, until I found myself on the wrong end of a noose, condemned by the very system I served without question. It has made me wonder how many other men I have hunted might have been as innocent as I was, caught in circumstances that looked like guilt but were not." Louise reached across the table then, her hand resting briefly atop his, a gesture so unexpected that Jeremiah nearly forgot to breathe. That kind of doubt is not weakness, Jeremiah. It is wisdom. The men who never question themselves are the ones who become dangerous. Her hand withdrew almost as quickly as it had appeared, as though she had surprised herself with the boldness of the touch, and a silence fell between them that was not uncomfortable so much as charged with unspoken possibility. Over the following weeks, their supper became a regular occurrence, twice weekly, then 3 times, as autumn deepened into the cooler days of November. Jeremiah delayed his departure from Prescott again and again, telling himself he needed to recover fully from the ordeal of his near hanging, though in truth he simply could not bring himself to leave the woman who had, without either of them quite realizing it, become essential to his happiness. He learned that Louise possessed a skill few in Prescott knew about, one that would soon prove crucial to both their futures. She was an exceptional markswoman, trained by her surveyor father, who had insisted his only daughter learn to defend herself against the dangers of frontier travel. She kept a Winchester rifle in her modest home near the schoolhouse, and on Sunday afternoons when her teaching duties allowed, she would walk out to a secluded canyon a mile beyond town to practice her shooting, a habit she had maintained since arriving in Arizona Territory 4 years prior. Jeremiah discovered this secret quite by accident on a Sunday in late November, when he had gone walking to clear his head after another restless night spent thinking of dark-haired schoolteachers and the strange direction his life had taken. He heard the crack of rifle fire echoing through the canyon, and curiosity overtaking caution, followed the sound to its source. What he found stopped him in his tracks entirely. Louise stood at the mouth of the canyon, her calico dress traded for a simpler outfit of trousers beneath a long duster coat, her hair braided back and tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She held her Winchester with the easy confidence of long practice, sighting down the barrel at a row of tin, set atop a fallen log some 60 yards distant. As Jeremiah watched, frozen in astonishment, she fired 5 shots in rapid succession, each one striking a dead center, sending them spinning off into the brush with metallic clangs that echoed off the canyon walls. "Good Lord," Jeremiah muttered under his breath, unable to hide his shock as he stepped forward into the clearing. Louise turned at the sound, lowering her rifle with the same calm precision she brought to everything, though a flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks at being discovered. "Jeremiah, I did not expect anyone to follow me out here." "I heard the shots," he said, still staring at the fallen cans, then back at her, trying to reconcile the schoolteacher he had come to know with this vision of frontier competence standing before him. "Louise, that was some of the finest shooting I have seen from anyone, man or woman. I have hunted bounties for 6 years alongside men who called themselves professional gunmen, and I have never seen anyone place 5 shots that clean at that distance." Louise allowed herself a small, proud smile, setting the rifle's stock against her hip. "My father insisted I learn. He said a woman traveling the frontier without the ability to defend herself was a woman waiting to become a victim, and he refused to raise a daughter who could be so easily victimized. I have practiced every week since we settled in Arizona Territory, rain or shine, whenever my teaching schedule allows." Jeremiah walked closer, examining the row of cans still standing, noting the tight grouping of holes in each one that had already fallen. "Would you show me? How you hold the rifle, I mean. I consider myself a fair shot, but I have never seen anyone group shots that tightly at that range." Louise's eyebrows lifted with evident surprise. "You want me to teach you?" "I want to understand how you do what you do," Jeremiah said honestly. "I have spent my whole life believing that skill with a gun belonged to men who lived hard, dangerous lives. I never imagined a schoolteacher could outshoot half the bounty hunters I have known." Something shifted in Louise's expression then, a kind of quiet vindication mixed with genuine pleasure at being seen clearly for the first time by someone whose respect she had come to value. "Very well. Come here, and I will show you how I hold the stock against my shoulder." For the next hour, Louise patiently instructed Jeremiah in the finer points of marksmanship that her father had taught her. How to breathe evenly before squeezing the trigger, how to account for the slight pull of wind across open ground, how to keep both eyes open while sighting to maintain better depth perception. Jeremiah, despite his own considerable experience with firearms accumulated through years of dangerous work, found himself genuinely humbled by the depth of her knowledge and the precision of her technique. "You could have been a bounty hunter yourself," he said at one point, only half joking, as she corrected the position of his elbow with a gentle but firm hand. "You would have put me out of business years ago. Women are not permitted to hold such positions, as you well know," Louise replied, though there was no bitterness in her voice, only the matter-of-fact acknowledgement of a world she had learned to navigate on her own terms. "I contented myself with teaching instead, though I confess there are days I wonder what my life might have looked like had I been born a man with the same skills." "I think," Jeremiah said slowly, watching her reload the rifle with practiced efficiency, "that the world does not deserve to know what it has missed by keeping women like you confined to schoolrooms. You are the most capable person I have ever met, Louise, and I do not say that lightly." Louise looked up at him then, something vulnerable flickering across her usually composed features. "You truly mean that?" "I have never meant anything more," Jeremiah said, and in that moment, standing in the golden light of a November afternoon with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, he understood with sudden clarity that he had fallen in love with this woman, not despite her fierce independence and formidable skill, but entirely because of it. He had spent his life around men who mistook a woman's competence for a threat to their own masculinity, but Jeremiah felt no such threat. He felt only awe and a deep, abiding respect that settled into something far warmer as he watched her lift the rifle once more and fire another perfect shot. Their walk back to town that evening carried a different quality than their previous outings, a new closeness born of shared vulnerability and mutual admiration. As they reached the edge of Prescott, where the canyon trail met the main road, Jeremiah stopped and turned to face her fully. "Louise, I need to tell you something, and I hope you will not think less of me for the timing or the manner of it. You may speak freely with me, Jeremiah. You know that by now. I have delayed leaving this town for 6 weeks," he said. "I told myself it was recovery, then gratitude, then simple friendship. But the truth is I have stayed because I cannot imagine my days without seeing you in them. I know I am not the sort of man a schoolteacher's mother would choose for her daughter. I have no permanent home, no steady trade beyond the dangerous work of hunting men for money, and a past marked by violence I am not proud of. But I have never known anyone like you, and I find myself unwilling to ride away from Prescott without telling you that my feelings for you have grown into something far deeper than gratitude." Louise's breath caught audibly in the quiet evening air, and for a long moment she said nothing, her dark eyes searching his face as though reading the same careful evidence she had once presented in a courtroom. "Jeremiah, I have spent 4 years in this town telling myself that my purpose lay in teaching, that I had no need or desire for a husband who would only ask me to abandon the independence I fought so hard to claim. I watched my mother's life narrow into nothing but the management of my father's household, and I swore I would not repeat that pattern. I would never ask you to abandon anything," Jeremiah said quickly. "Louise, I fell in love with you because of your independence, not in spite of it. I have never wanted a woman who needed rescuing. I want a partner, someone whose strength matches my own, whose mind challenges me, whose courage puts my own to shame when it matters most. You saved my life with nothing but a ledger and an unshakable commitment to truth. I do not want to diminish that woman. I want to stand beside her." Louise's eyes filled with unexpected tears, quickly blinked away, though her voice remained steady when she spoke. "I have loved you as well, Jeremiah, though I have been too afraid to name it, afraid that loving you would mean losing myself the way I watched my mother lose herself. But you are not the kind of man I feared. You are something else entirely." He reached for her hand then, and this time she did not withdraw it, her fingers intertwining with his beneath the darkening November sky, the first stars beginning to emerge above the silhouettes of Prescott's modest buildings. "Will you allow me to court you properly then?" Jeremiah asked, not as a fugitive grateful for his freedom, but as a man who wishes to build a life alongside you, if you will have him. "I will have you," Louise said softly, "on the condition that you understand fully what you are asking for. I will not become a quiet, obedient wife who abandons her teaching or her rifle practice or her own opinions to please a husband. If we build a life together, it will be as equals or not at all." "There is no other way I would want it," Jeremiah said, and when he leaned forward to kiss her for the first time, beneath the darkening sky at the edge of the canyon trail, Louise met him halfway, her hand rising to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. Their courtship, once begun in earnest, moved with the particular intensity of two people who had already weathered a trial by fire together, and found in each other something rare and irreplaceable. Jeremiah took on work at the local livery stable, using his considerable skill with horses to earn honest wages, while he decided what permanent trade might allow him to remain in Prescott near Louise, a question that had once seemed impossible, but now felt like the only question worth answering. He wrote to the territorial marshal's office, formally resigning his bounty hunting commission, explaining in careful terms that a profession which had nearly cost him his life through the errors of overzealous lawmen was not one he wished to continue. But the past, as it so often does in matters of the heart and matters of justice both, refused to remain buried without one final reckoning. In early December, word reached Prescott that Silas Reed, the actual robber whose crimes had nearly resulted in Jeremiah's wrongful execution, had been spotted in the mining town of Jerome, some 30 miles to the northeast. Sheriff Hutchins, eager to redeem his earlier failure and perhaps assuage the guilt that had gnawed at him since the trial, organized a posse to pursue the outlaw before he could disappear into the vast wilderness of the territory. Jeremiah, despite his resignation from bounty hunting, felt a pull he could not ignore. This man had stolen not just money from a stagecoach, but had nearly stolen Jeremiah's life through the simple accident of resemblance. There was a debt to be settled, a wrong to be righted, and Jeremiah found himself volunteering to join the posse before he had fully considered what such a decision might mean for Louise. When he told her of his intentions that evening, seated at her small kitchen table over cups of coffee, her reaction was swift and sharp. "You cannot be serious, Jeremiah. You nearly died because this town mistook you for that man. Why would you willingly ride into danger to help capture him?" "Because if I do not help see this through properly, there will always be some part of this story left unfinished," Jeremiah said. "I need to see Reed captured and brought to real justice, not for revenge, but so that the truth of what happened to me is fully settled, so that no shadow of doubt remains about my innocence for anyone who might still whisper otherwise." Louise's expression hardened with a determination Jeremiah had come to recognize well. "Then I am coming with you. Louise, this is dangerous. Reed is a wanted man who has already proven willing to strike an innocent stage driver. This is not a canyon full of tin cans." "I am aware of the danger," Louise said, her voice steady and unyielding. "But I am also the finest shot in this territory, whether the men of this town wish to acknowledge it or not, and I will not sit idle in my schoolhouse while the man I love rides toward possible death. If you truly believe in the partnership you spoke of, Jeremiah, then you must trust my judgment and my skill now, when it matters most." Jeremiah stared at her across the small table, torn between the instinct to protect her and the deeper understanding, hard won over the past weeks, that Louise Collins was not a woman who needed or wanted protection at the expense of her own agency. She had proven her competence with a rifle beyond any doubt. She had proven her courage in a courtroom when an entire town had been ready to condemn an innocent man. To deny her the chance to stand beside him now would be to betray everything he claimed to love about her. "All right," he said finally, "but you ride with me, not behind me, and you make your own decisions about when and how to use that rifle. I will not treat you as anything less than the equal partner you have asked to be." Louise's fierce expression softened into something warmer, something grateful. "Thank you for trusting me, Jeremiah." The posse departed Prescott 2 days later, 6 men including Sheriff Hutchins and Jeremiah, along with Louise, whose presence drew skeptical glances from the other riders until word spread of her reputation with a rifle, at which point the skepticism transformed into a grudging, if surprised, respect. The journey to Jerome took them through rugged terrain, up switchback trails that climbed steadily into the Black Hills, past abandoned mining claims and stands of juniper and pinon pine that gave the December air a sharp, resinous scent. Louise rode with the same easy confidence she had shown at the shooting range, her Winchester secured in a scabbard at her saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the terrain ahead with the careful attention of someone who had spent years training herself to observe details others might miss. It was this very attentiveness that proved crucial on their second day of travel, when the posse made camp in a narrow canyon as evening approached. While the men busied themselves with horses and campfire preparations, Louise wandered a short distance from camp, ostensibly to gather firewood, and returned moments later with an urgency that immediately commanded attention. "There are fresh tracks along the ridge above us," she said quietly to Jeremiah and Sheriff Hutchins. "At least 2 riders, and recent, judging by the way the disturbed soil has not yet dried in this afternoon's wind. The pattern suggests they were moving slowly, perhaps watching our approach." Hutchins frowned skeptically. "How can you be certain of the timing?" "Because I have studied tracking as thoroughly as I have studied marksmanship," Louise replied evenly. "My father taught me to read sign as part of survival skills necessary for a woman traveling remote frontier regions. The edges of these tracks are still sharp, not yet softened by wind erosion, which in this dry climate typically occurs within an hour or 2 after formation. Someone was watching this canyon very recently, possibly watching us." Jeremiah felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the evening cold. Reed would know these hills. If he spotted our posse approaching, he might try to ambush us here rather than continue running. The posse hastily repositioned their camp, taking cover among a cluster of boulders that offered better defensive ground, and Louise's warning proved prescient within the hour, as 3 riders emerged from the ridge above, firing down into the canyon with the clear intention of driving the posse into confusion before making an escape past them. What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire in the fading light. The posse scattered among rocks and juniper scrub, return fire echoing off canyon walls in a cacophony that made accurate shooting nearly impossible for most of the men involved. But Louise, steady and calm amid the chaos, found a defensible position behind a fallen log and began methodically returning fire with the same precision she had demonstrated on countless Sunday afternoons. Jeremiah, positioned some 20 yards from her, watched in astonished admiration as she calmly tracked the movement of one rider attempting to flank their position along the canyon wall, waited for the perfect moment when he emerged briefly from cover, and fired a single shot that struck the rifle from the man's hands without inflicting a fatal wound, a feat of marksmanship that left even the hardened Sheriff Hutchins staring in disbelief. "Good God," Hutchins muttered, echoing Jeremiah's own earlier exclamation weeks before. "Did you see that shot?" The disarmed rider, clearly shaken by the loss of his weapon and the demonstrated skill of his unseen attacker, called out a hasty surrender, and moments later the remaining 2 riders, recognizing the futility of continuing the exchange, followed suit. As the posse cautiously approached to secure their captives, Jeremiah's heart nearly stopped when he recognized the tallest of the three men, a dark-haired figure with a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Silas Reed himself had ridden directly into the trap of his own making. "Well," Reed said with a bitter laugh as the posse bound his wrists, "I suppose I should have guessed my resemblance to some other poor fool would eventually catch up to me one way or another. Word travels even out here about a bounty hunter who nearly hanged for wearing my face." "You nearly cost me my life," Jeremiah said, his voice tight with controlled anger as he stood before the man whose crimes had brought him within moments of an unjust death. "An innocent stage driver was struck unconscious, and I was nearly hanged for your actions." "The world is full of injustice," Reed said with a careless shrug that only deepened Jeremiah's contempt. "I did what I needed to survive." "You should understand that well enough, being a bounty hunter yourself. There is a difference between hunting men who have earned justice and stealing from innocent travelers to line your own pockets," Jeremiah replied coldly. "You will answer for your crimes properly now, before a judge, unlike the rushed judgment that nearly claimed my life." The return journey to Prescott, with Reed and his two accomplices secured and closely guarded, carried a different atmosphere than the tense outward journey. The posse's mood had lightened considerably with the successful and largely bloodless capture, and stories of Louise's remarkable shooting during the ambush spread quickly among the men, transforming her reputation within their small company from curious oddity to genuinely respected asset. "I owe you my life twice over now, in a manner of speaking," Jeremiah said to Louise as they rode side by side on the final stretch back toward town, the mountains giving way gradually to the more familiar high desert terrain surrounding Prescott. "First through your testimony, and now through your marksmanship in that canyon. I do not know how a man repays such debts." "You do not need to repay anything," Louise said, echoing her words from the courthouse steps weeks earlier, though this time a teasing smile played at her lips. "Though I will say, watching you fight to protect our position back there reminded me why I fell in love with you in the first place, beyond simple gratitude for your gentleness toward me. You are a formidable man, Jeremiah Cooper, in ways that complement rather than diminish my own strength." "That is precisely how I feel about you," Jeremiah replied, reaching across the space between their horses to briefly clasp her hand. "I have hunted men my entire adult life, believing that strength and violence were the same thing, that a person's worth in this harsh territory was measured by how well they could impose their will through force. But you have taught me something different these past weeks. True strength is not simply the ability to overpower others, Louise. It is clarity of purpose, unwavering commitment to truth even when it is dangerous, and the courage to stand your ground when everyone else has already decided the outcome. You embody that strength more completely than any person, man or woman, I have ever known." Louise's eyes glistened with emotion in the afternoon sunlight, though her voice remained steady when she spoke. "Then, perhaps, we have both taught each other something valuable these past weeks. I have learned that a man's strength need not threaten a woman's independence, that partnership can exist between equals without either person diminishing the other. My father tried to teach me this lesson, showing me how to shoot and track and survive on my own terms, but I never truly believed a man could accept such independence in a wife until I met you. Then, let us not waste any more time proving what we have already learned to be true," Jeremiah said, his voice thick with emotion. "Louise Collins, when we return to Prescott, will you marry me? Not because you need saving, and certainly not because I need managing, but because I cannot imagine building the remainder of my life with anyone else beside me." Louise reined her horse to a gentle stop, prompting Jeremiah to do the same, the rest of the posse continuing ahead of them toward town, granting them a rare moment of privacy beneath the vast Arizona sky. "Yes," she said simply, though her eyes shone with a depth of feeling that transcended the simplicity of the word. "Yes, Jeremiah Cooper, I will marry you, on the same terms we discussed before, as equals always in every aspect of our shared life. Always as equals, Jeremiah agreed, leaning across to seal the promise with a kiss beneath the open sky, the desert wind carrying away the last remnants of the danger and uncertainty that had brought them to this moment, replacing it with a quiet, profound joy that neither had expected to find in the aftermath of near tragedy. The posse returned to Prescott to considerable celebration, the successful capture of Silas Reed and his accomplices restoring faith in the town's justice system and cementing Sheriff Hutchins's redemption in the eyes of the community he served. Reed and his men were transported to Tucson for proper trial before the territorial court, where the weight of evidence against them, including the recovered stolen goods from the original stagecoach robbery, ensured a conviction that would keep them from further harming innocent travelers for many years to come. But the story that captured the imagination of Prescott's citizens was not the capture of the outlaw, but rather the tale of the schoolteacher whose careful record-keeping had saved an innocent man's life, and whose remarkable skill with a rifle had helped bring the true criminal to justice weeks later. Louise Collins, once known primarily for her sharp mind and her unconventional insistence on precise, factual thinking, found herself something of a local legend. Her methods of careful observation and documentation held up as an example to the very students she taught. The wedding took place in late December, in the small Methodist church that served Prescott's congregation, with Mrs. Prout providing an elaborate spread of food from her boarding house kitchen and half the town, in attendance to witness the union of the bounty hunter who had nearly hanged and the teacher whose testimony had set him free. Louise wore a simple dress of ivory silk that her mother had sent from Ohio upon learning of the engagement, tempering her earlier disapproval with the pragmatic acknowledgement that her daughter had found genuine happiness, however unconventional the circumstances of that happiness might be. Sheriff Hutchins, in a gesture that surprised many who remembered his earlier rush toward injustice, stood as a witness to the marriage certificate, his presence a quiet acknowledgement of the debt he owed the couple for teaching him the importance of patience and careful investigation over hasty judgment. "I have learned my lesson about jumping to conclusions," Hutchins told Jeremiah privately during the wedding celebration, extending a hand that Jeremiah, after only a brief hesitation, chose to accept. "This town is fortunate to have both of you remaining here. Prescott needs people who value truth over expedience." Jeremiah, for his part, had used the weeks leading up to the wedding to establish a permanent arrangement with the owner of Prescott's livery stable, purchasing a partnership interest with the savings accumulated over his years of bounty work. The trade suited him well, drawing on his lifelong comfort with horses while offering the stability and permanence that his previous profession had lacked. Louise continued her teaching, now with the added satisfaction of a husband who supported her work wholeheartedly rather than expecting her to abandon it for domestic duties alone. Their small adobe home, purchased with combined savings on a quiet street not far from the schoolhouse, became a gathering place for evening discussions that ranged from territorial politics to the latest scientific discoveries Louise read about in journals sent from her former professors back east. Jeremiah, who had spent years believing his rough frontier upbringing left him ill-suited for such intellectual company, found himself instead flourishing under his wife's patient encouragement, borrowing books from her modest but well-curated collection, and discovering a hunger for learning he had never before had the opportunity to cultivate. Their Sunday ritual of rifle practice in the canyon continued as well, though now Jeremiah joined not merely as a curious observer, but as an eager student, his own skill improving steadily under Louise's expert instruction, until by the following spring he could nearly match her precision, though both of them acknowledged with good humor that Louise remained, and likely always would remain, the superior marksman between them. I have hunted armed outlaws across 3 territories, Jeremiah told her one Sunday afternoon in April, as she once again outshot him by a narrow margin, and my wife still puts me to shame with a rifle. I do not think I mind in the least. You should not mind, Louise replied with a teasing smile, reloading her Winchester with practiced efficiency. A lesser man might feel threatened by a wife who outshoots him. I am grateful every day that I married a man secure enough in his own strength to celebrate mine rather than resent it. How could I resent the very qualities that saved my life and captured my heart in the same breath? Jeremiah replied, pulling her close despite the rifle still balanced in her hands. You are the finest thing that has ever happened to me, Louise Cooper, and I intend to spend the remainder of my days making certain you never doubt how deeply I cherish the woman you are. By the following autumn, their happiness deepened further with the announcement that Louise was carrying their first child, news that filled their small adobe home with a joy that seemed to spill out into every corner of their shared life. Louise continued teaching through the early months of her pregnancy, adjusting her schedule as needed, but refusing to abandon the work that had brought such meaning to her years in Prescott, while Jeremiah found himself alternating between fierce protective instincts and profound respect for his wife's continued insistence on independence, a balance they navigated together with the same partnership that had defined their relationship from its earliest days. The child, a son they named Thomas after Jeremiah's late father, arrived in the early summer of 1879, a healthy boy with his mother's sharp, curious eyes and his father's steady, capable hands, hands that Louise liked to say seemed destined for either careful bookkeeping or expert horsemanship, though which trait would ultimately dominate remained, in the fashion of all such predictions about infants, entirely uncertain. Louise returned to teaching that autumn, bringing young Thomas to the schoolhouse in a basket during his infancy, the arrangement made possible by the support of a community that had come to genuinely respect and admire the woman whose courage and intelligence had saved an innocent man's life, and in doing so, discovered her own life's greatest happiness. The schoolhouse itself expanded the following year, funded in part by grateful parents and by contributions from Jeremiah's growing livery business, allowing Louise to hire an assistant teacher and expand the curriculum to include more advanced mathematics and science for the older students who showed particular aptitude, much as she herself had once shown such aptitude under her father's careful tutelage. 2 years after Thomas's birth, a daughter followed, whom they named Sarah after Louise's mother, whose relationship with her daughter had gradually warmed through an exchange of letters that grew increasingly affectionate, as she came to understand and eventually celebrate the unconventional but deeply happy life Louise had built for herself in the Arizona territory. Sarah grew to share her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's fearless spirit, and by the time she was old enough to hold a rifle steady against her shoulder, both her parents delighted in teaching her the same skills that had once saved her father's life and later helped capture a dangerous outlaw in a remote canyon. Jeremiah's livery business flourished over the following years, expanding to include a small ranch on the outskirts of town where he bred and trained horses, drawing on skills developed during his years tracking outlaws across difficult terrain. He never returned to bounty hunting, though occasionally the territorial marshal's office would seek his advice on tracking particularly elusive criminals, advice he offered freely, always making clear his preference for careful investigation over hasty judgment, a lesson he had learned in the most painful way possible and never forgot. Sheriff Hutchins, true to his word about learning from his earlier mistakes, went on to serve Prescott faithfully for another decade, implementing more rigorous procedures for identifying and questioning suspects before rushing toward judgment, procedures that likely spared other innocent men from the ordeal Jeremiah had endured. He remained a close friend to both Jeremiah and Louise throughout the years, godfather eventually to their third child, a boy named after him whom they simply called Dale, born in 1883 when Louise was 31 and Jeremiah 36, their family complete and their happiness, by all accounts among those who knew them, unshakable. Louise Collins Cooper continued teaching in Prescott for over 20 years, becoming something of a legendary figure throughout the territory. Her methods of careful, evidence-based instruction, producing generations of students who carried forward her commitment to truth and precise observation into their own adult lives. Many of her former students, when interviewed decades later by historians documenting the settlement of the Arizona Territory, spoke of Miss Collins, as they always continued to call her despite her marriage, with a reverence reserved for the truly transformative teachers whose influence extends far beyond the boundaries of any single classroom. The story of the bounty hunter who was nearly hanged for a crime he did not commit, saved by the meticulous testimony of a schoolteacher whose careful records proved his innocence, became something of a local legend in its own right, told and retold throughout Yavapai County as an example of both the dangers of hasty frontier justice and the profound difference that one person's commitment to truth could make in the life of another. Children in Louise's classroom, and later in her assistant teachers' classrooms after she herself had grown too old to continue full-time instruction, learned the story as an object lesson in the importance of careful observation, honest documentation, and the courage required to speak truth even when the crowd around you has already decided otherwise. Jeremiah, in his later years, would often sit on the porch of the home he and Louise had built together, watching his grandchildren play in the yard, where once young Thomas and Sarah and Dale had grown from infants into capable, independent adults who carried forward the values their parents had instilled in them. He would think back, on those quiet evenings, to the terror of kneeling in the dust with a rope around his neck, certain his life was about to end for a crime he never committed, and he would marvel at the strange, unpredictable turns of fate that had led him from that moment of absolute despair to a lifetime of profound happiness beside the most remarkable woman he had ever known. "Do you ever think about it?" he asked Louise one evening, many years after the events that had brought them together, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the same colors that had witnessed both his near execution and his eventual salvation. "That day in the street, when Hutchins nearly hanged me. I think about it often," Louise admitted, her hand finding his in the familiar gesture of comfort and connection they had shared for decades now. "Not with fear anymore, but with gratitude. If I had not looked out that schoolhouse window at that exact moment, if I had not recognized the importance of speaking up despite the risk to my own reputation, our lives would have taken an entirely different path. I might have spent my years alone, teaching children, but never knowing the particular joy of building a family with someone who truly saw me as an equal partner, rather than someone to be managed or protected. And I would have died an innocent man, my name forever associated with a crime I never committed, never knowing the woman whose courage and intelligence would come to mean more to me than anything else in this world," Jeremiah added, his voice thick with the emotion of a love that had only deepened through decades of shared partnership. "We were fortunate, Louise, in ways that still humble me when I consider how easily things might have gone differently." "We were not merely fortunate," Louise corrected gently, echoing sentiments she had expressed so many years before in that jailhouse conversation that had first revealed the depth of her character to him. "Fortune played its part, certainly, but so did choice. I chose to speak up when silence would have been easier. You chose to trust my judgment and respect my independence when many men of your era would have insisted on protecting me from danger rather than standing beside me as an equal. We built this life together through 1,000 small choices, each one reinforcing the foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership that has sustained us through everything since." Jeremiah lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her weathered but still capable fingers, the same fingers that had once written careful ledger entries that saved his life, that had once held a rifle steady enough to disarm a dangerous outlaw without inflicting a fatal wound, that had held their children as infants and guided countless students through the fundamentals of reading and reasoning and careful observation of the world around them. "I love you, Louise Collins Cooper," he said, using her full married name as he sometimes did in moments of particular tenderness, "as deeply and completely as any man has ever loved a woman, and I will continue loving you with everything I have for whatever years remain to us." "And I love you, Jeremiah Cooper," Louise replied, leaning her head against his shoulder as the sun finally dipped below the western horizon, painting the sky in its final brilliant display before surrendering to the gathering darkness of evening, "with a love that has only grown stronger through every trial and triumph we have faced together. You were the bounty hunter who caught the wrong man's fate, nearly losing your life to a terrible injustice, but in that darkest moment, you found instead the truest happiness either of us could have imagined. My testimony set you free that day in the courthouse, but it was your love, your respect, and your unwavering partnership that truly changed my life forever, transforming me from a woman who feared losing herself in marriage into a woman who discovered her fullest self precisely, because she found a partner worthy of her independence and her strength." They sat together as darkness settled fully over Prescott, the town that had witnessed both the near tragedy and the profound love story that followed, two people whose lives had been irrevocably changed by a moment of terrible injustice, transformed through courage, truth, and an unshakable commitment to genuine partnership into a love story that would be remembered and retold for generations to come, a testament to the power of standing firm in one's convictions, and the extraordinary happiness that could bloom even from the darkest circumstances, when two people were brave enough to see each other clearly and love each other completely, as equals, for exactly who they truly were.